likes to drink, so I can understand the full context of what they're saying and why they're saying it. On your specific points about the economy and I guess its relationship to public finances, I mean, I won't go over their GDP forecasts and all the rest, but I think it's fair to say that in any 1 year, GDP in Jersey can be very volatile because we have a finance centre, because we're a small island. But what's more important is that each decade that's passing, really, it seems harder and harder to achieve our potential growth rate. Not exclusive to us, it's happening all around us. But the trend is definitely that our actual growth rate is coming under some pressure. But of more concern to me is that our potential growth rate, the potential of the economy to grow at a certain trend rate is coming under pressure. I think when I try to explain why that is the case at the moment, I think for a whole set of reasons, particularly over the last 2 decades, but accelerating since 2016, we have multiple and converging threats or challenges to the potential growth rate of Jersey, particularly with its given current business model. Those threats have been well trailed here and elsewhere with respect to the International Finance Centre, our demography, the fact that both the demography itself is inflationary and the geopolitical situation net looks like it's inflationary. These are, as I say, multiple and converging threats on the way that we've traditionally wanted to run our economy and our business model. And I think you're starting to see that now in the economic data. So that's why I think we're in this period of more subdued growth than we would like. I think there are many ways in which that feeds through to the public finances. But I think the titanic issue, and I use that word advisedly, the titanic issue for the public finances is the extent to which our business model relies on an international finance centre and the tax revenues it generates. That is the issue. Any disturbance, material disturbance to that industry and therefore to the tax yield from that industry is, the level 1 risk to economic growth in Jersey. There are others, but that's the big one in my opinion. And I think, reading between the lines, that's the big one for the FPP as well.
So in that context, what steps can you take, or what steps are you taking to ensure the unsustainable growth in public finances, public expenditure, as highlighted by the FPP, is being addressed?
Well, I'm not sure I would use that word. I mean, I think for many years now, one way or t'other, certainly for the last 10 years, through very major shocks, Jersey has been able to balance its budgets, per its public finance manual and its legislation, and it's done that while retaining a AA rated balance sheet, independently assessed credit rating. So in the moment, I think it's unfair to characterise Jersey as being in any kind of emergency situation. Where I think we have to do more work and think more thoughtfully is about the strategic risk of that changing because of either disturbance to that industry or one or two other issues. So I think the issues in the future rather than now, I don't think that the current situation can be described as unsustainable, but certainly there's a major risk to sustainability into the medium term.
When you talk about the island's rating, and that can be, its rating is important for the finance industry in terms of its stability, or it can be because it enables Jersey to provide the government to provide the cash to pay for its day-to-day expenditure. Which element of that were you actually referring to?
I think you can take a credit rating, an independent credit rating, in many ways, but it's a validation of a level of fiscal responsibility. Not everyone can get a AA
Yeah.
rating, sovereign rating. It's an indication by those independent bodies to any current or prospective lenders about the credit worthiness and credibility of that particular sovereign. So I think I think it's a proof point that shouldn't be dismissed lightly. But I'm not disagreeing at all with John Cunliffe and his team that which is what I do, if you take a medium-term view and you take a strategic risk management view rather than a P&L view, on that view, there are risks to sustainability that need to be addressed.
Of course, that doesn't mean that one is going to rebuild the reserves, which the FPP is also suggesting need to be made larger.
Yeah, I mean, on the public finances and trying to change this trajectory, if you believe that the current trajectory could present significant risk, which I do, and I've said that, I've used the word precarious here, that's what I meant when I used the word precarious on that medium-term outlook. I think there are 7 levers you've got to influence the public finances. The current government, in my objectives, has focused on one of those levers, which is the cost of running the public administration. But you're absolutely right. Other levers include your reserving policy, your tax policy, all sorts of other things you can do. I think in terms of their recommendations, they certainly believe and have said that they're worried that spending more than you bring in without recourse to reserves probably isn't where you want to be. As I've said here before, I agree. That's why we're trying to reduce the cost of public administration with recruitment freezes, consultancy and all the rest of it. And you've now seen the published numbers for 24 from those endeavours. 25, I think, comes out in April. But even on 24, they're the equivalent of 4p worth of income tax increases that we saved through those measures that this government put in, so that they're material. So one of the ways that you address this is by starting to curb the growth and eventually reduce your outgoings. One of the other ways you can try and address it is try to grow your way out of some of the problem, which is why, of course, we've got what I regard as the most fundamental study of our financial services sector since we set the centre up, and that will be published in March. So we're trying to prepare the next government, both in the work we do in the public finances, the work we do on the finance sector, trying to prepare them to be as strategic as possible in responding to not just the FPP's recommendations, but actually responding to the biggest strategic issues facing the island. And most people would regard them as one and the same, but not everyone.
Well, one is a consequence, can be a consequence of the other.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
I just on a more detailed level, if you'll permit me, we've used some of the Social Security reserve to supplement this year's income. And what I'm not sure about, because I don't know, is whether or not there's been an actuarial report that would actually confirm that there is a surplus there to enable that money to be used, because we're looking to use 50 million a year for some years.
Yes, for 4 years for the next government term. In fact, this is something that I addressed before the festive break at CSSP, and the Minister for ESH has also sought to address. But to answer your question, and I think it's one of the recommendations / observations of the FPP that ultimately those drawdowns should only take place with the benefit of a comprehensive actuarial assessment as opposed to the benefit of actuarial advice. Again, the FPP is a cautionary body. It's an independent strategic part of our independent strategic risk management armoury, if you like, and they would rather that drinks cabinet wasn't opened. I think ministers always and everywhere have to balance advice from that body up with all the other issues that they're dealing with. And on this occasion, you know what they propose to do because it's a matter of public record. In the narrow, they did get actuarial advice, but not the benefit of a full assessment, because the full assessments are diary events, and I think it's was happening this year, in fact. So by the time this becomes live, if the next government continues with it in its budget, they will probably be benefiting from that advice. In advance of that, why do ministers feel that on the balance of risks, it was okay to proceed without a full actuarial assessment? They did get advice. The fund itself, if you look at it closely, is operating above 5 times peak expenditure. When it was set up by people that you know and worked with back in the day and updated by Terry Lesueur and others, it was always intended to operate at a comfort level lower than the level it's currently at. So it's I think it's well funded on its own terms. It was obviously never intended to go on in perpetuity. It was designed to deal with a particular challenge in our demography, and it's more than dealing with that challenge. And the question for ministers was, if it's already 5 or 6 times over its expenditure, when most comparable jurisdictions would operate at around 2 years, when some larger countries pay as you go, is it the right thing at this point to continue to fund it at the current levels, or to reduce that funding level, because they're still putting a lot of money in, they're just reducing them at 50. On the balance of risk, they felt that they had better uses for those funds, and that was a well-informed, well-researched decision that they made.
I've got one other question, if
sure.
you permit it. Managing finances, managing the public finances, should always be in the context of a longer-term government strategy. And I never quite understand what the longer-term government strategies are, because we seem to operate from one election to the next. What's your comment on that?
It's a very good question, and I always hesitate, as someone who's only been here 5 minutes in the scheme of government and spent most of my career in other places. And one of the things which I know annoys elected members and officials is when people from the private sector say you should just do this like the private sector, because they're not the same. They're not always comparable for a whole set of reasons. However, on your question, in the area of strategy, having a good strategy cycle which generates a strategy, I think the situations are comparable. And I would say my main observation from 40 years in other places is that the government of Jersey, at least with the 2 governments I've had to work with, isn't set up to have a proper strategy cycle. And if you don't have that proper strategy cycle, you can end up getting bashed about with the wind. You can become very tactical. And I think that's the thing that's missing now. We're doing a lot of work to try and set the next government up better to be able to do that on the public finances, which we've discussed and will discuss, on finance and other things. But I think it's a fair observation that, a really good strategy creates a consensus in the top team. Let's say it's the Council of Ministers for the purposes, just as you would with your board if you were a CEO in the private sector. That strategy identifies what the biggest problem is or the biggest opportunity is, and it therefore follows that a very select number of priority actions will be pursued to try and address that situation. And you need a strategy process which creates a consensus around that, because you need that legitimacy and, frankly, that compliance when you start to take action. And I think my observation in Jersey, but I'm not sure it's simply these 2 governments, I think it might have been going on for a while, is that doesn't really happen in a way that you would recognise as in the private sector. And while there's many things you shouldn't take from the private sector to the public sector, I think this is one area. Having a proper strategy for growth, which then informs your strategic positioning on your public finances, which integral to which is your strategic risk appetite, how much risk you're prepared to take as an island. these things, I think, need to be elevated, and I think it will make government more effective going forward.
And you said there that you're sort of doing work at the moment to prepare the next government for that scenario.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Now,
Okay.
my question, and I agree with the vision, and I agree, I think, with the assessment. What my question will be, and I would like that we'll get into the details and specifics. So the question that hasn't been answered, and I will repeat the question, what actions will be taken to ensure that we will not see overspends in 2026 compare the overspends that we've seen over the last years?
Well, my apologies, I didn't realise that was the question.
It was the question, what steps are you taking to ensure the public finance are correct? So I'm making very
Yeah.
simple,
No, I've got
simplifying it.
I've got the question. So this is an appropriately detailed point in that general debate, which is in 24 there was a major overspend, predominantly in the health budget. In 25 there may be overspends, and how do we stop this happening in 26? I think perfectly fair question. Do you want me to talk about the steps that we are taking in general to ensure that doesn't happen, or to use health as an example? What would be most useful to you?
I think we can start with health as an example.
Okay.
What will happen in 26 compared to 25 and 24? And if there are other areas that you're ensuring there is no overspends in 26?
Sure. So I'd say at the outset that, and of course you don't know the political and policy positions of a new government, but I'd be very confident that 26 will see a material improvement both on the revenue and in the way that we look after both sides of the P&L. You'll see a material improvement on 25, and I think 25 you can already see a material improvement on your question versus 24. So following what we saw in 2024, I guess that let's use health as an example. These are the steps that we've taken, which we think will continue to pay dividends this year. But just for the committee's memory, health, I think, had an overspend of 30 million at the end of 24. So a number of things we did. Firstly, of course, as we discussed before, invested a bit more in the MI and in the reporting in 2 or 3 departments, which are the departments which are always most likely to run into budget issues, I&E, SIPES, health in particular, and to a lesser extent in areas of Treasury, to give us better, earlier data if things were going awry. I should say, given that we're going to talk about health, partly in our defence, that when you're running a budget that size and you have to submit it halfway through the previous year, it is ridiculous that we operate with a zero tolerance for overspends and underspends, that we think they're going to hit the mark. No other organisation would do that. I understand why the public finance law is the way it is. But in any event, it shouldn't be 10% over, which it was in 24. That being said, put the MI in. At the end of Q1 25, health were reporting a projected overspend of 18 million. What's different from previous years is identifying it quicker. The second thing we did was put in place arrangements for enhanced oversight and monitoring by Treasury and enhanced ministerial oversight from the Treasury Minister to that department, or any department finding itself in that position. And really our aim there was to get on top of the thing quicker, to develop a financial action plan with that department at the end of Q1 and not wait till halfway through the year when you run out of time. That financial action plan, a joint endeavour between the department, of course, and Treasury and others. The aim there really in the first instance was to try at the very least to recover 50% of that projected overspend, to start working a number down and not have what happened in 24, which is the number went the other way. I'm very pleased to say that that number has come down materially as the year has progressed. as a result of that financial action plan and the steps that we've taken. In the case of health, the other thing that we did, which we wouldn't always do, was we had regime change. So in 2024, it was my advice and the Treasurer's advice that there was a case to be made for removing the turnaround team, the financial turnaround team in health, who'd been installed by the previous government on the advice of KPMG. I think the ministerial team, who were obviously in fresh in 24, wanted to give that team time to show that all the things they'd been working on through the winter of 23 could pay dividends. They were given that opportunity. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. So we've changed the finance team in health. And again, we regard that as a material action that will give us a better chance of ensuring that in 26 we don't have the issues that we had in 24, and to a lesser extent the issues that we had in that we have in 25. The final, they remain on heightened monitoring. The final thing that we've done from that work in health, which I think is a fair thing to do, is, again, I remind you, it's a $3 billion budget, and you're trying to hit a budget to balance at zero. Pretty difficult to do that in my experience in any walk of life. So there should be a tolerance of a couple of % here or there on these massive budgets. What we tried to do in that financial action plan is not only have them change strategies and change approaches in areas like tertiary care to start to work the costs down, but also try to figure out, in all fairness, what are these costs which were unforeseeable because they're a price taker in global markets for healthcare, and which of those costs are irreducible, that it would be pretty daft to try and take them out. And where we find costs like that, which are a minority of them, we should build them into future budgets. The final step I've taken in this area, but health is the best example, and I think you know this, is I've argued very strongly, partly to help the next government, for all the reasons we just discussed. I've argued very strongly that an annual budget, which is the prerogative of the Council of Ministers and is effectively a business plan, as opposed to a 4-year budget which is led by your Treasury, I regard that as a poor decision that was made at some point in the recent past, and I think it adds to the tendency to overspend. I think it contributes to fiscal ill-discipline, and I've recommended strongly that the next government move back to a 1+3, but effectively a 4-year budget. Because if you think about health, if they are 1 or 2% over in $250,000 budget, they should be able to work that through over a 4-year period, not be taking reactive action constantly at a tactical level.
A couple of things.
And I believe that proposal is in the budget that was lodged before Christmas to move back to 1+3.
Just to understand, so you're saying the turnaround team failed and didn't deliver?
The turnaround team will have their own view of what they were there to do and what the agreements were.
No, my question is simple. Have they failed in your reviews?
I wanted a change. I wanted a change in the finance team because of the budget performance in the 2 years in which they were in place.
Okay.
They were there to deliver a financial action plan which they agreed with the government, and they will say that they've substantially achieved that, and that's fine. But if you've achieved it and you're still 30 million over or 20 million over, at the end of the day, we've got to address.
But this is
the
the structural deficit, I think. Okay, I think the structure.
Again, those are your words, not mine.
No, I don't know, because this health budget grown by almost 100+ millions over 2 years. So that's the question. Another question, and I think it's really helpful. So you can assure that the government will not come back by the end of 2026 retrospectively requesting, like it's happened for 2025, 50 million because they overspent, because this year extra 50 million was requested in December to support 2025 spending.
What do you mean by that question? Sorry. 50 million was requested from who?
From the State Assembly to approve extra
do
50
you mean
million
do you mean the
for
related
2025.
for 2025? Yeah, I'm saying to you that the steps that we've taken and are taking, which are showing material improvements 25 over 24, I expect that to continue in 26 and for the next government not to find itself in the position the government found itself in 2024.
What areas should be prioritized by, just mentioned 3 departments to deliver future savings? Because there is lots of savings programs. And not all departments deliver on savings. So what will happen different in 2026?
Well, the disciplines I mentioned, obviously only in health did we seek to change the finance team as part of the tightening of our approach to this area. Every other department has been subject to the exact same measures that I described in health, save for changing their finance team. So we expect in all departments those measures to have that same effect and that same discipline. We had a number of departments who were forecasting an overspend at the end of the first quarter. They will all have got, not to the levels of health, one should say, but they will have all had similar treatment in terms of heightened monitoring, oversight, more detailed work in the financial action plan, more detailed work around their cost base. And we're seeing a similar pattern in that most of those departments, to the extent that they had a problem, that problem's falling close to zero or close enough to zero that I wouldn't regard it as material.
So my question in this case different. So in quarter 1, you know that departments are going to overspend. You do have conversation with the chief officers. When the ministers, and if ministers were informed, and if chief officers and yourself offered an option, what needs to change during the year to ensure that there is no overspend by the end of 2025?
So at the end of the first quarter, what happens is they forecast on their run rate a budget overspend. Obviously hasn't happened, but it's likely to happen because you're 3 months down in the year. So projecting that forward, you may have an overspend. In the financial action plan process, we generate options. We generate options for savings. Those can be anything from saying, I know you were planning to do that this year, but we recommend you don't because you've not started it. So one of the best ways to save money is to stop it being spent in the first place. So all the normal things you'd expect to have in a proper budget process, those happen. I operate, as we've discussed before, trust and verification with officers. Most of these risks or issues related to overspends are in our language level 3 risk or departmental risk register issues. It's that chief officer's job to come up with a package which meets our requirements under the public finance law and around which they can build a consensus with their minister to the extent that their minister is pre-concerned about some of those issues. That's their job, not my job. If they need help, I'm there, but they will get on with that.
But if a principal accountable officer, it's your job to ensure that the public finance are in place and we don't, whatever, it's according to the law that you have funds assessed and referred by any, it's your function to ensure the public finance spent accordingly. So if I'm going back, and I agree with you, and it's really helpful that you're taking all steps. The question, can you assure the committee that based on your expertise and based on the instruction that you're giving to the chief officers, we will not have overspend in 2026?
Obviously, you can't give that assurance because any number of things can happen in a budget which is 1.3 billion. What I can assure you is that lessons were learned from 24, lessons have been learned from the experience in health, that additional measures have been put in place, which I've outlined. those measures empirically in 25 have made a material improvement in year in the situation and prevented a repeat of 24. We continue those measures in 26 and start
So
over those
what you would
measures.
do to ensure how you can
I'm
act?
answering your question. That's what I'm doing to ensure it. You can't guarantee it because any number of things can happen in a health budget over which they've no control. But
Okay.
what we're trying to do is ensure that there's a level of discipline there that we feel wasn't clearly there in earlier years.
Can I just ask?
Yeah.
You did set out the plans of what you expect chief officers and departments to do. What's the consequence if they don't do it?
There's various consequences. Obviously, chief officers have got a lot of things to manage, but if we feel that there's a performance issue, then we performance manage. If we feel it's time to change, and sometimes people just get jaded in the job and need a change, then we make changes. And I think you'll have seen that we've tried to get a bit more circulation around those chief officer roles in my brief stint than where we can. But yeah, ultimately it's a performance management issue, provided we're not in a situation, of course, where an accountable officer is in receipt of a letter of comfort because it's an event-driven issue or a policy-driven issue. They can't be really be in receipt of a letter of instruction because you can't instruct an accountable officer to overspend, if you see what I mean. You've got to bring your budget in, but you can certainly get a letter of comfort if there's an area of spending which people would regard as irreducible or unforeseeable, or that minister goes to the political table and says, I know I didn't anticipate this or require it, but I think now that we understand what it is, it's a bigger priority than some of the other things that we're doing around this table, and they would seek permission to, in that situation, and get a letter of comfort.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I've got a question as well. So, just understanding from an accounting point of view, overspends don't happen like one day it happened and we didn't knew about that in the last 3 months or something. There always is a trigger event. That's why overspends happen and everything, which you have just mentioned. There are budgets and everything. We are going through the process. Have we identified those trigger events from the past years and made some protocols around them that, okay, if this thing is going to happen, anticipated in 3 months, we know that, okay, we've already made some efforts to reduce that overspend or restrict that overspend. So are we monitoring that closely?
It's a good question, and I definitely encourage you, as soon as I hear the word accountant perspective, to speak to the Treasurer in more detail. I have no ambitions to be an accountant. That being said, going back to Philip's first question briefly, because we don't have a strategy cycle the likes of which I would expect to see, we haven't established our strategic risk appetite properly. In the absence of strategic risk appetite, I'm not saying anything goes, but anything can be tolerated, right? Number one. And some of the issues that we have in budgets, I think, reflect lack of clarity and strategic risk appetite. If we continue with the example of health, to answer your question very narrow, when we diagnosed the 30 million, 18 million at Q1, we could see, to give one example, one of the biggest drivers of that, and the deputy will know because it was an issue even when she was in the health ministry, is that we rely very heavily on, in my view, far too many, but a range of NHS England providers to support our health service with particular services. Because of the fiscal strains in the British NHS, all of those hospital boards are effectively increasing their prices on all of their suppliers as they battle their own fires in healthcare, because we're not alone in this. So one of the shocks we could see coming through was significant price inflation from those providers, and or withdrawal of services from those providers, which then push you to recontract, and you're recontracting at a higher rate. So that's an example where in the action plan, we've been doing a lot of work with the health team. In the narrow, some of that's contract work to say, let's get the contracts out and be absolutely clear what we're contracted for and whether this pricing is right. and whether our contracts are being respected. We did a big piece of work there, a long piece of work with NHS England and Wales, and we've corrected that because we felt that we were, not always getting the treatment that we expected under the contract. But what we've also been doing then is trying to develop new strategies in the commissioning framework for how are you going, what's the best way to have those services delivered if we feel that our current arrangements are inherently inflationary, are going to give us an inherent budget problem. So you'll get very detailed actions, and those actions from the Financial Action Plan in Health are now being fed into a very detailed modelling exercise around that budget, which should conclude, well, it will conclude during PURDA, because it's one of the things that we want the new government to have at its disposal. So it's that kind of iterative loop we're going through. If
I'm going back to 24 and 25, and actually what will happen 26, what performance management measures have you taken in respect of overspend?
Performance management measures on
What
individuals.
performance management has you taken in respect of overspend for the chief
I
officers?
think when you look at those in detail, it's not always clear that the performance management issues, in the extent that colleagues will have been flagging up that they're experiencing unexpected inflation in certain areas of budgets, that they're experiencing unexpected inflation for certain drugs, which they've almost got no choice but to procure. So you have to understand whether you think someone has done something which has made the situation materially worse, or whether you feel that you've got a business model and a health service which is at the mercy of a global crisis. But again, if you look at health, you'll see there's
No, just a minute. We spoke enough about health. We had overspent in 2024, not just in health. We did have and will have overspent as is in 2025. I understand there are some global unexpected events, but would you believe that all overspent because of the unexpected events, or there are overspend that related to performance management, to the performance?
Oh, well, there's overspends related to all sorts of things. There's assembly amendments we didn't see coming. There's people asking us to give money to delivery bodies we didn't see coming through the political process. All sorts of things can change the budget. I guess my point to you is, for a budget of 1.3, 1.4 billion, it is nonsensical to think that that's going to be zero on the 31st of December. So
my question wasn't about...
Please let me finish.
I would like to ask...
Please let me finish.
I respect, but what my question was very simple.
And I was going to answer it if you let
but
me.
you're going into the budget and budget debate. My question was simple. What performance measures taken... What are performance management for the chief executive?
If you take 2025, if a colleague or a department is 10% out from their budget and it can't be explained by extraneous factors, irreducible factors, unforeseeable factors, that will be a performance management issue. If you're looking at a budget of that size and you're talking about 1 or 2 percentage points here or there, that's unlikely to be the case. That again tells me that you need to move away from the tyranny of the annual budget and actually try and manage these big budgets which have multi-year contracts, multi-year commitments over a more sensible time frame.
So my understanding, there was no performance measures taken in 2025. Yeah.
I've already been clear that that's not the case, but never mind. Yes.
Could I just pick up on what Ali was saying before, on what threshold trigger that a formal notification of overspend? And you said you don't see that consistency across all departments. So how can you make that process consistent within identifying as soon as where that threshold trigger is becoming worrying in each department?
I think it's fair to say that you've got a handful of big operational departments, then you have a handful of policy departments which aren't big operational departments. I do think that's one of the design issues that needs to be looked at by the next government. there's a world of difference between a policy ministry, which some of these departments are, and running something like a fully integrated health service. So
What
you're right to say that it's not. It's not. They're not all the same. We kind of know that those big operational departments have more things that can knock their budget about than, say, external relations as a budget. And we tend to focus our resources and our efforts in those areas that we would be most worried about, which we think are riskier to begin with. But I think that the measures that we apply to all departments, and the public finance law does this as well, of course, I think in our current system, it's fair that everyone faces the same disciplines. I just think we should be realistic about where the risks lie in the budget, and the risks lie in the current structure, in infrastructure and environment, in education and in health, and obviously they lie in Treasury as well in terms of getting money in. Those are our 4 big areas of risk.
Could I just ask
Yeah.
a question? Andrew, could you just give us an idea of what the run rate looks like over the next 4 years for the public sector budget? And aligned to that, could you sort of give us an idea about what sort of performance management approach will be different to achieve a better outcome than what you've described over the last 4 years?
So the run rate for
Public sector budget.
the public sector, but I mean the budget, the budget process. The budget is the budget as published. The projections are the projections as published. As I've said before, you can only really focus on next year's budget because of the current system we've got, which I recommend hopefully will change.
Can I just ask a supplementary to that? And I agree with you in that. But there will be revenue commitments made that are very similar year on year. So what I'm trying to understand is what your understanding is of what those revenue pressures might start to look
Oh,
like.
on the revenue side rather than the cost side?
On the cost, on the revenue side rather than the cost.
sorry,
Because I
no.
think cost is a performance management issue, isn't it?
It is a performance management
Revenue
issue.
is different.
It's also a political issue, we should say. Everything in those budgets has a politician and a policy behind it most of the time. And we've seen that again today in the newspapers. So on the revenue side, I think there's a couple of big risks if we look at it at a strategic level rather than we should let health out of the witness box. The biggest strategic risk is the issue that came up in Philip's question, which is disturbance to the International Financial Centre. The challenges arriving at the door of our International Financial Centre, as I said, are many, and they are converging to a level that I can't really recall in my time in the industry. And to give you an example of this, you know, we've got spending of 1.3.5. We've got revenue of about 1.3. 40% of that revenue directly, before you talk about its indirect impact, comes from that industry. Now, this is important. That's 600 million or thereabouts. So the Titanic risk is anything that makes that number materially smaller.
Sure.
I don't think we should be relying on that 600 million as it stands today. I think it's risky to assume the 600 million is for keeps. But that we are where we are until we change that around. So the biggest risk is that one. The second biggest risk, I think, is what's colloquially becoming called the cost of living, which is the government has a range of fees and charges that it has around the place for its services. It has the option in the next government as well to look at whether it extends that for things like wastewater. Governments, in the face of general inflationary pressures emanating from demography and geopolitics, might find it difficult to implement price increases or fees and charges that they've put in their budgets in good faith.
So
So I
that's
think
why
those are the
trying
two
to,
risks.
I'm trying to just tease out, given that scenario, what might you as the chief executive be considering now to address some of the pressures that are going to hit the public sector as a consequence of that?
Yeah. So the question is not about the risks, it's about what you do about the risks. Well, the main reason that the Chief Minister has put in almost every quarter something around curbing growth and the running cost of the public sector is because of that risk. So the first answer to that question is, of course, try to avoid expenditure through your recruitment fees. I would recommend those continue for the whole of the next government, but certainly for the rest of this calendar year. I would continue and extend the changes we've made to our approach to the use of consultants, which, as I say, in 24 alone, which was only 4 months worth of work, we saved the equivalent of 2p in income tax from the money that we reduced in that budget. I expect to see a stronger performance again in 25, but famous last words, we'll find out when the numbers come out. So I would continue with all those things that I've mentioned, and as a matter of policy under development or work to prepare the next government, I would expect in July to sit down with whoever the next government is and say, here are some other things that we think will address the risks you're worried about. What is your political appetite for those measures? So that's when I talk about trying to prepare so that we can be a bit more strategic going forward. I think there's a number of things that you can do which will yield savings over a long period of time, which require strategic choices as opposed to whack-a-mole stuff.
Do you think that there will be a need for even more austerity?
That presupposes that, what's your example of austerity from the past 2 years? What would you see as austerity?
Well, I think people talk about a reduction in the quality of the public service, which is a value that we don't normally talk about. I think we talk about sort of delivering the same for less amounts, but I think there are, you know, if you take health, for example, we've got longer waiting times, waiting lists, we can't recruit staff. And I'm sure that there are other places, other departments who are struggling with similar themes around the quality of service that they're able to offer because of the reductions and the efficiencies that they're driving. So I think when you've talked about the fact that we're reliant upon income because of the International Finance Centre to support our public sector expenditure, if we're going to actually try and get a curb on that and manage all of the activity that is still there, what I'm trying to understand is, do we need to make even more significant reductions or changes? And does that lead to a period of austerity, for example, that we've never seen before?
Well, I think a couple of things here. Firstly, there's been real clarity from the Council of Ministers that we should be achieving savings in the cost of public administration without impacting their definition of frontline services. And I think that's happened. So far from having recruitment issues, for the first time in a long time, we've effectively managed our vacancies in nursing, for example, down to probably the lowest level it's been for a long, long time, and certainly within the normal bands of turnover. So we aren't having the difficulties recruiting in these areas that maybe people think we are. So I don't recognise that characterisation. What I do recognise is that if you've increased the costs associated with the public service by a third in 7 years, by, you know, several £100 million at a time when your finance centre is facing multiple and converging challenges, at a time when your non-financial sectors have found it going very tough because of the inflation, the global situation, at some point you're going to have to cut your cloth. And really the big debate, I think, for the new government is how it cuts that cloth, because I go back to my answer to Philip's question. It is a titanic risk to assume that you're going to get 600 million from one industry from here till the cows come home.
So we can expect big change then.
Okay, we'll move to the next area.
Okay.
No, just, yeah.
Thank you. And talking about cutting of cloth, the Treasury Minister on the 11th of December 25 during the budget debate stated that the Chief Executive Officer now has a clear mandate to bring forward proposals to resize the public sector and has begun that work. Whereas previously, on the 12th of February last year, you said, I don't really have a mandate for significant reorganisation or restructures of the civil service. You wrote to us on the 9th of April last year saying, given the mandate I have in terms of reorganisational structure, it would not be appropriate to outline any vision for a novel structure for the public service without prior agreement from the Chief Minister and the Council of Ministers. However, I fully agree with the principles of delivering balanced budgets to support long-term sustainability through curbing growth in the public sector and redirecting monies saved to those areas where it's most needed. Could you please tell us what has changed, when it changed, and when you anticipate being able to deliver the new vision for the size of the public sector, and specifically whether you anticipate that it will be in time for the public to be informed for the election next year, this year?
So I know that when they're debating in the chamber in big debates and heated debates like Treasury, all sorts of things are said, but let me be super clear. And you've got my objectives and confidence every quarter, going back to when I was in secondment. The mandate is the curbing mandate. The mandate is to look at any options to slow down the growth of inflation in the cost of delivering the public service or in the cost of public administration. That's why we've taken out 100 civil servants but not taken out 100 nurses, for example, to answer the last question. So that mandate for me hasn't changed. I imagine, without having the transcript and being there when the Treasury Minister spoke, maybe there was an anticipation that they'd be able to accelerate work between then, the end of the year and the election. But that's not the case.
Would it be helpful if I read you out the full quote?
You can read it as often as you want. I'm going to tell you it's not right. I don't have a mandate from the Council of Ministers to do that work before the election. I have a mandate for the Council of Ministers, which we share at Assembly workshops in confidence, next one of which is next month, to make sure that the next government, as well as having some tried and tested options, which we've been testing in this, discussing today for curbing growth, has probably the best ever fact base they've had on the growth in public spending and the cost of it, and we will publish that hopefully next month, or certainly before Purdah that will be published, and that we put them in a position to have a really good strategic debate as a new government. I don't think I've got any mandate from this government to do that before the election. And there's understandable reasons why they wouldn't give me that mandate, I think, given that there is an election.
Thank you. So, no mandate. We're very clear about that. That's very helpful. Thank you. I would like to move on to the question of productivity, and I appreciate that it may seem slightly arcane, or some aspects of it may seem slightly arcane. But another quote from an elected representative, this time the Chief Minister in the JEP on Saturday, said that ministerial workshops are currently being held as part of the most comprehensive review of public spending Jersey has ever undertaken, and that they're focused on becoming more productive, halting growth and stabilising the position. And you've confirmed that these workshops are taking place now in your letter to us of yesterday afternoon, and I believe that's what you're referring to just now. Could you please confirm that?
So when I think at the start of that quote, you said he was preparing to, could you just repeat it to me, sorry?
Sure.
I should read the paper more often, I appreciate that.
There you go. The most comprehensive review of public spending Jersey has ever undertaken.
That was me referring to what I expect will be published either at the workshop, or certainly I would expect it to be published in the next, between now and when the government breaks off for the election. So that's what we've been working on. That's going through the normal due diligence with the chief statistician and everyone else, and I expect that to be published. That's to try and establish a comprehensive fact base for everyone who's interested in government being elected or participating, to understand how that money was spent in that huge run-up since 2018, where that money went, and so that it can inform the strategic debate I was mentioning to Philip earlier.
Thank you. So you've referred extensively to external factors and how external factors can blow us off course, whether they're to do with the nature of the predominant industry over here, whether they're to do with cost inflation, inflation generally, etc. However, there is one aspect that is firmly within the gift of the executive, which is productivity. And while I appreciate, as I said earlier, that it may to some people appear arcane, you've confirmed that these workshops are taking place and that they must therefore represent the most comprehensive review of spending Jersey has ever undertaken. We wrote to you at the end of last year requesting some productivity data, and you wrote back to us, and I have a great deal of sympathy with what you have said, and I'm sure that many others will have, which is that while the government has significant volumes of data, processing that data to produce meaningful management information can be a resource-intensive activity, and that while both measurement and benchmarking are useful tools, a wholesale program of measurement and benchmarking may not be proportionate to its benefit, and I do not believe would necessarily provide assurance of service productivity. Amongst the data that we requested but you've declined to provide is any estimate of benchmark productivity of Jersey against itself, in other words, where we stand today. My question to you is very specific. How will you know, how will the Council of Ministers know, whoever that may be, pre or post-election, whether the measures they seek to employ will have been effective without a productivity benchmark?
So I think we are still to get data to you, is that right?
Yeah.
So the departmental data you asked for is still to come. As I said before, where there is comparable data readily available and readily comparable, we use it, and we will include some of that in the report that's to come out. And obviously it got released after the public finances workshop I'd prepared for the previous government before it fell. I did hold it with the new government, and we published that data in March of 24, I believe. So wherever we've got data that we think, and more importantly, the independent statisticians think is credible, we put it out there. We also, of course, in those big departments we've been talking about as part of this preparation to improve matters, the 4 big operational departments, we've put specific data and analytical resource into those departments, working in concert with the statisticians at the centre to try and improve the frequency and quality of data about the services, including those benchmarks, to the people running those services. And I think I've invited you several times now, and CSSP, to pay a site visit to sites to look at that in action. So we have been doing a lot in that area. I think if you look at my objectives across both governments, neither government has commissioned me to do a deep productivity study. Both governments have felt that there were other priorities. Both governments were concerned about significant growth in a short space of time in the size and shape of the public service. The current government, in addition to the previous government, was additionally concerned about the complexity that's arisen from the estate of delivery bodies. So they were wanted more work done, which is what we're starting to publish on those issues rather than productivity in the narrow. I'm a trained economist. I've got more degrees in economics than I've got hot dinners. I love productivity. It's a fascinating, complex concept. I could talk about it for years, but I honestly think that both chief ministers have called it right. For the reason I said in my letter, I don't think, and I can go into a lot of economics on it, or we can have a private discussion, I don't think at this juncture that that kind of study would add as much benefit to the governing of Jersey and its government as other things that they would have me do in the meantime.
Thank you. Notwithstanding your opinion on this matter, the law remains that you are obliged to ensure that the funds and assets of the island are used economically, efficiently and effectively, and notwithstanding the lack of any mandate from the Chief Minister or any other party, the law remains the law for the time being, until it's changed. Mike, I have sympathy with, again, the argument you presented in your letter of yesterday afternoon, where you say that the lack of availability of comparator data and suitability for comparison due to constitution, size of population, demographics, economics, including prevailing industries and identifying metrics that drive better decisions, is an obstacle to producing productivity stats. My question at the beginning was to do with baseline productivity of Jersey itself, so that we can measure future productivity changes with respect to Jersey.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to the law and those things, I mean, I think, okay, let's get into productivity. It is a very difficult thing for Jersey in both its public and its private sectors, for the obvious point of the manifest diseconomy of scale and scope that exists when you're running a country that's the size of Crawley, 100,000 people. A bit prettier than Crawley, but 100,000 people. You are beset by diseconomies of scale and scope. You have all sorts of issues around the 6 definitions of efficiency. I'd encourage everyone to the CNAG's report on the same. So we have thought about that quite deeply. We also know in our system that our biggest constraint is labour, the availability of labour and the use to which labour is put. And while in many other contexts, and you know, I wrote a PhD on it in the automotive industry, so I'm very familiar with it, you obsess about the outcomes from the inputs. I think in Jersey we need to go through a period when we obsess about the use to which we put the inputs in the first instance. So in the public service, that's why under these initiatives for curbing growth, there's been a real focus on removing civil service roles from the centre and taking initiatives such as displacing expensive agency labour in health with full-time equivalents and trying to make that work within the budget. So I'd say we've been taking a lot of steps which people would recognise as us trying to be more productive, but we're taking those with a sense of how you have to operate in an island like this, given the sorts of things we want to do. And I really go back to the last of Philip's questions. If people in this table and all the people in the balcony who keep writing articles in the Jersey Evening Post telling the government and the politicians how to run the country, if they ever want to get on the dance floor, they're very welcome. All of you people, if you think the number one issue for Jersey's productivity, make that your strategic imperative and then set your whole strategy up to address it. Wouldn't be my number one issue, but that's not important. As long as the next government agrees what the number one issue is, they can then put these sorts of things into the objectives of the chief executive, amongst others.
Thank you. We people in this context must therefore include the Chief Minister, who says that as part of the most comprehensive review of public spending Jersey has ever undertaken, his first focus is on becoming more productive. I appreciate your arguments that you are conducting affairs in such a way that you are stripping away input costs. Nonetheless, with other complaints you've made about the organisation of the island, specifically, and we will be coming on to this in a moment when Deputy Kovash has an opportunity to pose some questions, you've referred to activities undertaken by ALOs and their proliferation and the lack of oversight in one place of them. Are you not at significant risk of failing to, of achieving reductions in government spending, but merely displacing them into other areas like ALOs? And how do you know, which gets back to my initial question, how do you know that you've improved things if you're not measuring how things have changed against where you were to start with? This is the fundamentals of productivity measurement. And as somebody with as distinguished an academic career as yourself, you will understand why a baseline is particularly important. I'd like you to explain, please, so that the public can understand in simple terms, why with the data that you have available, you don't believe that baseline productivity measures are important as part of administration as usual?
What I said was productivity is important, but both chief ministers during my tenure have thought other things were more important for me to focus my time on. So that's a different thing. On the issue of, I haven't complained about these bodies, that was an observation, but on the issue of the chief minister, one of the reasons we're doing such and have been doing such a lot of work on public expenditure and having council of ministers workshops and having workshops with all assembly members invited is before you can get to the sort of debate I think you want to have about productivity, you really need to up the ante on the data. So a lot of the work has been gone into upping the ante on the data. On baseline productivity, again, each department, this is a big responsibility in each department. If we take education as an example, the previous government, continued by this government, invested to increase the number of teaching assistants in schools by 198. That's a huge investment, quite a disturbance to the local labour market because those people had to come from other industries into those jobs. So we had displacement from the retail sector, displacement from the hospitality sector. Anyway, it was decided that that was one of the biggest problems in the education system way back when, and it's been addressed. That sort of input cost, we'll only know the outcome of that in 16 years when we can start to look at whether we've seen material improvement in all the dimensions that the department measures. And they measure all the departments, not just educational attainment, attendance, dysregulation in class.
Thank you.
It will be measured over time, department by department.
Thank you.
And again, I implore you to go and visit the education department, sit down and go through this stuff with them and get an insight in it, because it makes more sense at 2,000 feet than it does at 30,000 feet.
Thank you. I'm sure that's right. But as the Public Accounts Committee, we are at 30,000 feet, and our job is to make sure that the public gets assurance of that it's getting, bang for its buck. And so that is actually our job, unfortunately. So, look, I'm going to move on. You referred a few moments ago to the data that is forthcoming from the different departments. Our specific question was to provide details of the benchmarked activities or service areas compared with both Jersey itself and comparator organisations and jurisdictions, and you've said that you've requested a schedule and you'll supply that data in due course. My very specific question to you is, and actually no, I'll put in a little bit more context. Given your role as chair of the Gibraltar International Bank, and therefore within a jurisdiction of a very similar size both to Crawley and to Jersey, you'll be familiar with the productivity statistics that they are legally obliged and very good at producing, including year-on-year productivity ratios, input-to-output ratios, etc. My question to you is, in relation to the other comparator jurisdictions that you are employing for the purposes of the public workshops and such like work, can you please tell me which other jurisdictions you have benchmarked Jersey against and why?
Yeah, so on Gibraltar, first of all, it's a fifth the size of Jersey, and it's an isthmus, it's not an island. It's part of the Iberian Peninsula, so it's got very different characteristics. I worked with Colin Powell in 1994 to produce and develop input-output tables for Jersey. Those were kept up for a long period of time. Not sure why the Independent Statistics Unit moved away from them, but I'm sure if you got Ian along, he'd be able to tell you why. So I'm familiar with all of those things. We look at, there's a couple of things here. Firstly, whether in some of the studies to which we participate, to which the Chief Statistician participates, we've discussed before, the OECD Better Life Index, not all of our comparator jurisdictions choose to participate. They choose not to spend the money. We have a bigger statistics budget than our comparator jurisdictions, and we participate in a lot of things that they don't participate in, and we generate a lot of data, discretionary survey data, that they don't. I would agree with the general thrust that I would like more of that budget spent on hard data that could inform productivity than survey data, but that again is that's we've got an independent statistician, that's almost their business. So we do look at, and when we have what we published in March 24, which was what was done under the previous government, where we do think that we have data that is comparable with other jurisdictions, which is statistically robust, which is not always the case, then we publish it. OFAG data, which is published, we will use the OECD data, which is published. So we will look for comparators, but we are always guided by the knowledge of the Chief Statistician as to the reliability and comparability of that data. So even if you take our nearest and dearest neighbours in Guernsey, in many areas they produce data which appears to be the same thing, but actually methodologically is quite different, and therefore isn't really ideally suitable for comparison. So it's a fairly tricky area when we get into it.
Thank you. So to be clear, you have provided the Council of Minister workshops with adequate, in your opinion, comparator data from tax-neutral jurisdictions with low tax takes out of GDP, such as 23%, which I believe is the Jersey figure, suitable for them to arrive at informed conclusions.
We've shared the best we got, the best we could find, which people around this table have seen already. Where we have more budget and more time. So I mentioned in response to the first set of questions, we are concerned about the multiple and converging threats to our international finance centre, and we're concerned about the impact it would have on the public finances. There we've done much more detailed work. We've tried to get even more granular with all the other comparable jurisdictions who have a finance sector within them. Obviously, a lot of that data is commercially sensitive, but I'd be very confident that when he moves to bring it fully into the public domain, the minister or the officials would happily give you a private session on that comparable data.
Thank you. I'll just repeat that I was referring to the most comprehensive review of public spending Jersey has ever undertaken, and not the threats, which I appreciate. You have a complicated, tough job. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And before I move to the next sector, how do you ensure the changes across departments align with a single long-term strategy?
On what, sorry?
Generally, like the changes that and savings done in all departments, how do you ensure that this align with a single long-term strategy?
The strategy of the government, the strategy of...
The strategy that the government mandated or is looking to achieve, how do you take on all departments on board with these changes?
Yeah, so to my earlier point, I do think a gap in the way we go about things is not having a strategy in the sense that the public who work in other industries would recognise, therefore not having a strategic risk management cycle and risk appetite quite the same way. So what you're doing effectively is using as your reference point, if you take the current government, the CSP, because that effectively is their strategy for action, or at least it's their business plan for action. And you're also relating constantly back to public finance manual and other statutory guidance around. So there isn't a strategy, I think, in the sense that you mean it, but I would recognise that that's one of the weaknesses of the way that we're currently operating. And it's the one thing I would try and change for the new government.
Okay, thank you. So still in the area of savings, but a bit of a different register, how my colleague mentioned around the arm's length bodies, align with our wider review on that as well. So my next question would be, the public finance manual states that periodic reviews of arm's length bodies should be undertaken by accountable officers. Would you expect accountable officers to comply with this provision, or if not, explain why not?
Yes, so there's a whole range of delivery bodies in there, a multitude of them, but certainly, and you've seen the examples of the Information Commission, Jersey Sport and others, we would expect them each year to review the performance and the role of those delivery bodies, if that's what they're required to do. And we've got live ones at the moment where they're doing them because of the scrutiny there's been on this. I've paid particular attention to that this year in terms of how, for example, the Economy Department is scrutinising Jersey Finance Limited and so forth. And I'm satisfied that, at least as I understand their obligations, which you've just read out, that they should do these things, particularly if they've got good reason to, if there's been any kind of particular trigger or issue, then they do that rigorously and with probity.
So is that consistency of them doing that, and what oversight exists to confirm compliance?
Well, again, it's back to how we run the place in the trust and verification model. They have responsibilities as chief officers to run their departments. They, like everyone else, have to prioritise time. So when it's something you should do, that means it's going to be prioritised to those areas that you think you really need to do for one reason or another. And it will lead you to, you might put some in a different cycle from others, depending on your assessment. And chief officers, in my experience, again, I always say I've only been here 5 minutes, but in the 5 minutes I've been here, they've typically focused obviously on those ones with the biggest budget relative to their budget, or with the most sensitive delivery schedules. They've focused on ones where there's been any kind of disturbance or issues, whether it's at a governance level or whether it's a spending level or a political level. They've tended to have reasons for why in that particular year they might focus on one more than another, but it's something that they're very alive to, and it's something that they do. And as I say, at the moment, I've been shadowing through a couple to just, for the very reasons I think that you're asking, understand how they go about it and what it involves. And I think they're fulfilling their obligations. I think one of the challenges with delivery bodies is they are quite political, as we've discussed before. They've usually been set up as a standing army for a political reason as much as a practical reason, and they are political animals. They lobby.
In your opinion, what would be the implication of mandating compliance with ALB reviews?
So rather than being shoulds, being must. Well, I think it would require a resource allocation within all those departments.
What additional capacity would that
It'd create capacity issues for sure, and they'd have to ration out other work to do it. And again, it's that issue of it's a choice. You could do that. Next government could do that. I think the next government would be better off doing what I've said before, is taking a step back and thinking, why in a place the size of Crawley have we created 23 bodies since 2011? Why in a place the size of Crawley have we created 5 CEO positions at the equivalent of my level or more since 2011 to be able to run this tiny place. So I think that debate should happen before you mandate every one of them's reviewed. And I think, you know, there's the Institute of Government conferences on at the moment. There's a brilliant quote from the British Prime Minister expressing his manifest frustration that every time he pulls a lever, he finds himself having to deal with standing armies of quangos and ALOs and regulators and this one and that one. And it's ages before he can get from his policy thought to anywhere near having an impact, because he's wading through stuff that the government has created. And, you know, I've been very clear. I think we've been copying our big brother. We've got the same institutional sclerosis, and I hope the next government uses the data that we're gathering. I hope they use the data from this committee. Obviously, your report, I think, will come out before the election, and that we'll have an ability to be strategic about these delivery bodies and the necessity of them. What I wouldn't recommend in the first instance is we move straight to let's have mandatory reviews of all of them.
Okay, thank you. Karen.
Can I just follow up on your observations there in terms of where do you think all this work needs to go? Where do you think all of the work that they do needs to go?
What all of the work who do,
ALBs do.
where it needs to go. In terms of, well, I think they're all different. This is the trouble. So I call them delivery bodies now because I got into terrible trouble when I tried to who's in and who's out. But as a government, if it exists because at some point in time we thought that we needed something delivered that wasn't being delivered, whether it's Digital Jersey or the Care Commissioner, whoever it is, it's a delivery body. We thought something needed delivered that wasn't being delivered. So I think we just need to clarify our strategy, clarify our strategic risk appetite, and then figure out if we still need these things delivered. And if we do need them delivered, do they need to be delivered this way? Because it's a very expensive model to run. And, you know, the great example, and I see that it comes up regularly, is that for whatever reason, we have created a multitude of regulatory and de facto quasi-regulatory bodies and commissions and commissioners. And
So would you actually recategorise some of those such that some functions and work needed to be retained in the public sector, and that would that come under a different shape of government?
I think it needs to be looked
or
at
would that,
through three
sorry,
lengths.
can I just finish my question? Would that come under a different shape of government, or would you wish, as you say, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to retain some of them because you think that some of the functions don't actually need to be delivered, but some of the functions do need to be delivered, and you're casual about where they need to be operating from?
I look at it the other way around, and of course it's easy when you just come in and look at everything fresh, and people have been living in this house and putting extensions on it for 30 years. They think it's okay. But when you come into the house the first time, you think, why are there so many extensions on this house? This is very complex. So I think the next government, one of the things that will have to get its mind round is having a strategy for economic growth, for all the reasons we just discussed. If it has a proper strategic look at growth, it may or may not arrive at a different position on competitiveness and the balance between regulation, risk and growth. If it did arrive at a different position from the one we're in, that would be the strategic trigger to say, well, hang on a minute, in pursuit of competitiveness or in pursuit of lower cost, we need to look at this whole set of delivery bodies here with a view to, close, repossession, amalgamate, whatever it is. You need to look at it fresh. What I don't think you can do is just go into it on a whack-a-mole basis. As I've said before, it needs to come from strategy, and the strategy's not quite there. And the other thing about these bodies, I would say, is just coming into public service and working in this environment is we've tended to look about it as a cost issue. To me, it's a democratic issue as well. So in the era of ministerial government, a lot of responsibility has been placed into these bodies, which are quangos in various forms. And I think there's a democratic accountability issue to be explored, the same as the British Prime Minister was making, which is to say, hang on a minute, how accountable democratically is this? And I don't just mean when they pay themselves something and politicians don't like it. I mean, actually, have we created a democratic deficit in the way we set things up? I think there's definitely a pure complexity effectiveness issue. Should we really have to engage so many bodies to get something done? And then, of course, there's a cost issue. So I think once you get past the strategy point about whether you need to change strategy, therefore you need to change your delivery bodies, I think you would then look at those three things. Because to my mind, many bodies have been put at arm's length from government, but it's a chimera because the risk can't be transferred. So the government remains the 100% equity owner, 100% politically accountable for that activity. Therefore, if anything goes wrong, the government will have to put more money in or have to take accountability for it. And to me, that's not, if there's no risk transfer, you have to question whether it's worth spending so much
That
money
goes back
on a
to
separate
my
organisation.
original question, which is where do you think that work needs to be done? If you're not discharging it to
I think
another
once
body.
you've reset your strategy, you decide whether it needs done at all. And if you think it needs done at all, you then use you look what's in your purse in terms of what you can afford, and you look at your commissioning framework and say, what's the best way to deliver that activity if I really think it needs delivered? And also the frequency of it. You don't have to do everything on an annual basis. You can kick the tires every 3 years and maybe get a better outcome in terms of the gap between a review and your ability to respond to a review. And I think that's another challenge we've got in the service.
Thank you.
Very quick question. Would you agree, I mean, my understanding, I'm not familiar with it by any means, but I understand that some of the delivery bodies were established because they were better capable of delivering those services than government. They could, for example, provide greater productivity, greater innovation, greater efficiency. Would you agree that that was part of the reason behind it?
So I think when you look at them, all sorts of different reasons in different points of time. The reason why we set up the overseas aid team would be different from the reason why we set up digital.
Take Jersey Water.
You're talking about state-owned enterprises in our language.
And delivery organisations.
Delivery organisations. So I think certainly and I've looked at this historically, of course, in terms of when things were set up, you certainly had in the first 3 governments of the ministerial government era, what one might describe as centre-right governments, who had an ideological position that the private sector could deliver greater efficiency and effectiveness of private sector structures than public sector structures. So that was certainly a driver for bodies like Andium, state-owned enterprises and some of the other bodies. The other driver in there that is prominent is that those governments desire to raise debt off the public sector balance sheet in these bodies to invest in essential infrastructure. So a desire to invest fundamentally in social housing, a desire to invest in water infrastructure, presumably. So we've got a private register in electricity because 50 years ago we had to build La Calette. So there's different drivers at times, and some of those make sense. What I think we have to do is just be really consistent. We can't create these bodies and say we want you to run on a private sector basis and then leave the executive team in the government pension scheme, for example. That to me is fuzzy thinking.
Okay, so the drivers I understand and the objectives I understand. Were they objectively efficient? Is I guess the question that we're asking. Did they achieve their purposes? And what I think as a committee we're scratching our heads over is whether how you find out without carrying out the structured reviews and the periodic reviews properly?
So you can, for example, in the case of telecoms, water and others, you can go into private arrangements to understand the productivity of comparator organisations in other places. You're obviously dealing with commercial sensitivity here, and we do have insights from that which are commercially sensitive about the performance of utilities,
Okay.
and that governs the approach ministers and officers take to those utilities. Those are sensitive matters, but let's not kid ourselves. These are monopolies, duopolies, and on a good day, oligopolies. So I've never believed that changing ownership as opposed to changing market structure is going to give you a big productivity gain. And the UK water industry, I would suggest, is a great example of it not working. So I think if you go back to where I was with you in productivity, we are Crawley, we're 100,000 people, we're a very small island with finite resources. We're never going to be an Adam Smith model for how you operate these areas. We need, our first priority for our utilities is security of supply. It's a defensive quality, we need it. Our second one is the quality and reliability of that infrastructure, because we have very few options if it doesn't work. And then you go on to trying to do that with all your inherent scale disadvantages as efficiently as you possibly can. That's the world we find ourselves in, and it's not comparable with many other worlds.
So government could be a better solution for some of these.
I don't know about that, or whether it would make much difference now, or whether it's worth the candle. All I'm saying is it's very difficult to go back to that ideological position, it's very difficult to get appreciable productivity gains simply by changing ownership as opposed to changing the market structure. We're not able, in most cases, to change the market structure, so we should be very careful about our expectations for productivity gains simply by privatising something or by, allowing its executive team to operate under different conditions and different remuneration packages from a civil servant.
Okay, thank you.
And can you advise your understanding of the difference between grants and commissioning, and how well does commissioning work?
Oh, jeepers. No, I'm just going to notice. I mean, the way I think about it, and I hesitate with, where are we here again? I hesitate with the CNAG in earshot of me of doing this, but the way I can't find notes in it, but anyway, the way I think about commissioning is almost part of strategy. It's a strategic process for deciding how you use the total resources available to you and organise them to deliver a particular service or set of outcomes. That means it's a bit more than cash, it's a bit more than giving money, it's about all your resources. Where you give a grant, of course, is one aspect of that. That's one of your delivery options, where you can give a grant to someone to deliver something for you. But commissioning, I see, is much wider than that. One of we're still in the foothills, I would say, of it. But one of the sort of really insightful things for the public service, and certainly for the health service, has been the work of the CNAG and others around the need for a commissioning framework and better commissioning, which obviously we've adopted. We've got a cross-government commissioning group, very active group. We've invested quite a bit in that to try and improve in this area. So I think we're in the foothills of it, but that's how I see commissioning. I see grants as just only one part of that. And I'm very conscious that as we move to that new approach to commissioning, which I think is bringing more rigour more probity. I think it's bringing necessary governance and process, which helps public servants not just deal with the organisations that they may or may not end up in a relationship with, but helps them also with politicians, because civil servants are there, politicians come and go, but you have to go through that process of how things are done. So I think it's really helpful, but you can see again today that as you try to pursue better value for money and efficiency through these structures, you are going to disturb some long-standing relationships.
So one of my question is related to what we've seen in the newspaper about the Jersey Employment Trust, 38 employees being affected by the decision. So my question will also be how these changes consider when funding decisions are made, how much notice is typically given, how is service continuity protected?
So are you talking about that specific situation or in general?
That in general, but
In general, there'll be different situations depending on what's happening. But in those situations where, after a lot of thought inside a government department, they decide either that they want to change the service catalogue of the department, so Social Security or RS, they want to change aspects of their service catalogue, either because of a policy change or because of best practice or because of the commissioning framework. That's their prerogative. That's why you're in government, hopefully, if you want to change things. Where they want to change it in situations like the one I think that you're alluding to, typically we would be doing that with a 12-month lead-in. We would be saying 12 months out from the contract ending, or if it's an annual contract, saying this is the last contract which will operate in this way. We need to get into discussion about the following things because we would like to see changes, either because needs have changed in what is our intended client group, or because the organisational needs changed, could be either.
So was it sufficient notice given in this particular case?
I think now, I came straight here from somewhere else. I know the Minister, put it here, the Minister's put out a statement, but certainly, in this particular case, you all know the Minister involved who used to sit in that chair, who was a very talented civil servant in Social Security for many years. They will have approached that with the probity, rigour and empathy that you'd expect of that person. So I'd be astonished if there wasn't a 12-month lead time in that particular case. And I hope that the statement she's put out hasn't contradicted me.
Check and follow
You check that.
if we have further questions on this. Would you say also are grants used where services could be delivered directly by government?
Yes, that does happen. That happens everywhere, not just here.
And how is duplication avoided in these cases?
I think in this area, again, we need to go back to strategy. I think a really important strategic issue when we get to it is this. Obviously, we're trying to curb growth in the public service. We have 500 registered bodies in the charitable sector or the third sector. A significant number of those bodies have come to possession over time where they're completely dependent on government for funding. They're not able, for whatever reason anymore, to access private funding to the extent that they were, or the private funding's going away. So I think we need to have a strategic thought about how we commission and how we procure with and what relationships we get into with these bodies. Is a big part of the social fabric of the island that we engage the social capital and volunteerism of the third sector in providing a variety of services around the island. And it's a great situation when the money's flowing. When the money gets tight, it becomes, I think, quite tricky for those organisations and quite tricky for government. So again, I'm going to sound boring. I think in the absence of strategy, anything can happen. You don't know whether to say yes or no. You don't have an anchor, strong enough anchor in strategy. You do in public finance manual, you do in the commissioning framework now, which is helping us. But you still need a strategic anchor which says, in running this country, how much use do we really want to make of the parish system? How much use do we really want to make of the voluntary sector in areas like health versus more direct? And I don't think the body politic has had that debate properly for a very long time. Therefore, to me, it's very sporadic, it's very noisy, and it's very political.
And to kind of bring it back to the importance of those reviews, being grants or commissioning, how this effectiveness is evaluated post-award.
Yes. So again, we're in the early days of it because it stemmed from observations over a number of audit reports from the CNAG, and then actually some thought piece input from the CNAG about the need for such a framework. We've invested in it. It's rolling out across the public service for all the reasons of consistency that you're alluding to. And we recognise that as we roll it out, we're entering into more, probably, in some instances, more structured and more methodical conversations with delivery bodies than they've maybe been used to in the past. And that's a challenge for them, and it's probably a challenge for the body politic as well, which tends to operate on a more informal basis in Jersey. And I've got total sympathy for all sides. I was the chairman of a huge charity, national charity, for 8 years or whatever it was. I understand everything that goes on in that sector and how difficult it is, particularly if you find yourself in a position where your only source of funding is government. No charity ever really wants to be there, but sometimes you end up there.
Before I move to my colleague, how many civil servants oversee LBs, and is this sufficient?
About 30 would have that oversight role of, again, not getting into definitional issues, but what we regard as the main delivery bodies. There'd be about 30 for the obligations which someone quoted earlier under the Public Finance Act and what's expected in terms of oversight. That is sufficient. If you move to a mandated annual review, that would be insufficient. And I go back to my previous answer. I think rather than move to mandated review and ask me to hire another 30 civil servants or something, I'd rather we do the strategy first. You really work out, you need all these bodies, and then we say, okay, we better structure around that.
Okay. We've got about 14 minutes left, Andrew, if you need to take a check on the time. The first thing I just wanted to ask you was, could you tell us what progress there has been made on the accountable officer's oversight of executive remuneration in arm's length bodies?
Well, when it comes to the state-owned enterprises part of that, we're kind of, as we were the last time I updated you, I think in the Public Finance Manual and through the SEB, we've got some tightening up now, and we've got for new bodies that are set up an expectation that they will accord to civil service pay grades, and the SEB will have oversight of that. So I think where anything new is created, and you know my stance on creating new things at the moment, but when new stuff's created, we have new things in place. For the SOEs, it's pretty much as it was before, but you know, I know everyone complains about this, but the ministers have been through this, and you know, they seem content that they're able to for the most part have the oversight and influence that they need over those organisations, particularly around remuneration.
And are benchmarks consistently applied?
In those peer reviews, yes. So and that's one of the challenges, right? So they quite often use third-party remuneration specialists who are usually part of executive search type firms for that. But it's a really difficult business because is anything comparable to Ports of Jersey? Well, it is on paper, but in terms of size and scope and so forth, it's really quite tricky. So I don't envy those remuneration committees trying to figure out what an appropriate benchmark is. They can see comparator pay for SOEs on island, they can see other comparators on island, and then they can see sector comparisons from off island, and then you have to try and make a judgment call. So I'm satisfied to go through a very rigorous process. Whether people like the outcomes, you know.
Can you tell us specifically which ones have been done so far?
Well, the SOEs, they're done every year. They've got REMCOs.
And not SOEs.
The ALBs.
The ALBs, I need to write to you on that. Any of the new ones certainly have been done. I need to write to you on the
The public finances manual was updated in August.
Was
So
it
it's
August?
anything that will have been reviewed since then, and of course anything that's been set up more recently has been under SEB
Yeah.
line
Yeah.
of employment.
Well, I think we write back to you on the middle category, which is the ones since we changed the guidance in August, as opposed to the ones that are under SEB. You mean the ones that aren't under SEB, I
Yes,
presume?
please.
Digital Jersey, those
Yes.
people?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll write back to you on him.
Okay,
and your team.
thank you. Could you advise if you see any duplication of property development between Andium and SOJDC regarding social housing or sales of private property? And if so, what plans do you have regarding this?
So, duplication of property development, I don't know about that, but I think again, when we I keep saying this, hopefully within the new government, when we take a step back and look at these things, we have arrived at a situation where we have a property development function inside three bodies that we set up. In addition, and many of them are people that used to work in the planning department, so it's the merry-go-round of Jersey. I do think, given the challenges we've got in terms of the public finances, in terms of productivity, in my view of productivity is our biggest productivity challenge, is taking our scarce inputs and applying them to the best possible use, because the opportunity cost of not doing that is very high. I think when you take that lens, you'd have to ask an open question about whether those bodies all need separate development arms or whether you couldn't tidy the whole thing up. But of course, that's a matter of policy almost for ministers and in the current construct, in some cases, for the boards of those companies.
So you don't have any particular plans regarding
No.
addressing some of that duplication?
No,
That's
we're,
okay.
we're, to the answer I gave before, we're late in the term of this government, so all I want to do is make sure people get information so that if they want to look at anything, they can do it quickly.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just pressed for time, that's all. So during the last hearing on the 8th of October last year, you mentioned whether it is amalgamation of ALOs or whether it is completely changing the nature of some of the services we offer. We are not there yet, and I think it is important, very important, given my tenure, that we come up with options which have got consensus. So are you able to advise when you would have an idea around which, and if ALO should or should not amalgamate?
Yeah, I mean, I think on that particular issue, it falls into the answer to the question about the Treasury Minister's statement. I think at the point where I said that, I'd be more than willing to generate options. I think the realities of the political cycle are that we kind of stop with the publication of this data that we're talking about, and that it's a matter for the next government whether that's a policy option they want to pursue.
Do you feel hesitant in doing it now?
Well, I just think, as always, you go back to where I was at the start. It's my sincere hope that the next government goes through a strategy cycle where it sorts out the things that it really matters to it.
Yeah, I
And if
know
it
that, you
decides-
said that, but
if
I'm
it
just
decides
concerned
this
that
really
you've got
matters
this
to
in
it-
your head now, and you've
Well,
got
yeah,
some
but, I
ideas
mean-
about what you could offer that might be helpful.
Yeah, well, let's be honest. I think everyone would have an opinion on these issues who interacts with these organisations. So it definitely, if it's an area which the new government thinks is a priority, we'll be able to move very quickly to say there's different ways you can do it. I don't, it doesn't seem, and there is no mandate to do that.
To do it now.
To do that now.
Okay, thank you.
Can I
Do you-
just ask,
sorry.
what barriers you see preventing shared services now?
Which,
What barriers prevent shared services now within these ALBs?
well, I think it's the independence with a small I of those organisations. So to take an example, which I think has come up before, or certainly the chair's asked me about before, as part of the business plan to move into the new office in Union Street, we vacated Jubilee Wharf. Obviously, we've been having discussions with all ALBs to join the party in terms of curbing costs. I have to say, led by the CNAJ here, was the view that many of our regulatory and oversight bodies potentially could share office accommodation and take that cost out of their individual P&Ls. We've progressed that. The building's been refurbished for that purpose. The CNAG's moved in or moving in, chief pharmacist moving in. The other bodies, for one reason or another, are reluctant to take that step. Some of them have written to us, like Care Commission, to say thank you, but no thank you. Others are saying, let's get into negotiation. So, you know, we're trying to coax people along. And back to the Prime Minister's point, maybe we should just be saying, let's just do this because we don't want to pay for 10 properties. Can we just all get in and make it work in the big house? But we don't have those levers at the moment, and I think these are the things you need to look at.
Thank you.
Do you get any appetite for any joint board working or any joint procurement or anything like that?
Nothing that I can call to mind straight away from the non-SOE ALOs. From the SOEs, the utilities, we get a lot of that. They are always looking for opportunities to collaborate or to do things together, less so from the sort of middle group of bodies we've been talking about.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Just, can you advise the PAC if all the agreed recommendations to the C and AG oversight of arm's length bodies have now been implemented? And if you can advise PAC of any outstanding actions and the reasons why?
Yeah, can you take that?
As far as the agreed actions that we've taken from the previous reports and the action plans that obviously been shared with the committee, we have one remaining outstanding in relation to the remuneration. The other actions have been completed.
Okay.
Let's move to David.
Okay, so that's a hop through. Okay, fine.
Oh, one or two.
No, that's fine, no problem at all. So it's about oversight of governance. How do you, as Chief Executive, assure yourself that appropriate governance arrangements are in place across major operational and commercial decisions, and what mechanisms do you rely on to identify when those arrangements are not working as intended?
Give me an example of what you mean by a sort of major operational or commercial decision. What sort of thing?
Thank you.
Like, what indicator signal failure?
Oh, well, in my time, there haven't been too many of these big decisions because in the technology estate, for example, my predecessor, but two, made the major investment. So I've been more in licensing agreements and all that sort of stuff. There've been a couple of big commercial issues, which are now public knowledge, transaction by Jersey Telecom, and obviously the ferry concession where I was conflicted, so I didn't get involved. So the only two I can explain the process to you are the £30 million investment, multi-year investment in Transform, which is the new social security system, or the new hospital.
What about ferries or airlines?
Ferries, I was had conflict or perceived conflict, so I was same with telecoms because of my previous role. So I can't give you insights into those ones. In the case of, so I could either give you a procurement, which is Transform. In the case of or in the case of the airlines, I presume you're referring to
The Loganair.
Loganair Blue Islands. So that's one where, of course, by the time I arrived, the credit had been extended mainly as part of COVID, so it was a long-standing position. My involvement only came when further support was extended to them earlier last year, and the business case for doing that, the rationale for doing that, I was given an opportunity to review and brought into those meetings by the shareholder function in the Treasury and by the Treasurer. So he would, in actual fact, in legally, the escalation in all these matters is to ministers rather than to officials. But obviously they brought me in part because of my past experience. So in that situation, I would understand their rationale and their thinking and the process that they're following and the advice that they're taking. And I would receive that direct from the Treasurer and the shareholder function within the Treasury. And I would also participate where necessary in those meetings where ministers were briefed and relevant ministers discussed it. So that's what happened in that. Look, it's a bit of an unusual situation, that one, because obviously we have no desire to be the lender of last resort to a provider of last resort in any situation.
I mean,
But
obviously,
that was an emergency in COVID. So on Transform, it's a pretty straightforward process. They create an outline business case for what they want to achieve if they believe that they need to completely and fundamentally change the technology platform in customer services. That outline business case is discussed in a non-decision making roundtable format at ELT, so everyone, the other departments can understand what's going on and what's hoped to be achieved, and they can join in case there's synergies. We then set up a cross-government group on that, particularly the technologists and other parties, and they work it up to a full business case with the minister's involvement. At full business case stage, it would be brought back to ELT, and it would typically go to a council of ministers that size, and then it would either go into the growth bid process, or in that case, I think that was funded from the Social Security Fund. It would still go through the equivalent of the growth
In
bid.
summary, you're quite comfortable though with the process.
It's the sort of process
it's robust.
It's the process I'd expect.
Yeah,
It's the
yeah,
process
okay,
I'd expect
okay.
for it.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. Do we want to ask any more, or are we done?
We're
We're done.
time.
We're
The
done.
last one.
I have one last question
Okay,
to
sure.
yourself before we finish, and it's a very simple question. I hope it's a simple question compared to all others that we had. As a CEO, we are at the beginning of 2026, and could you advise what outcomes you wish to achieve by the end of this year, and it will be end of your 3.5 years tenure? So where now? What would be? We'll come back in December, have a conversation. What you would say?
Well, I've taken a sort of engineering approach to this job rather than a visionary approach, because I came in as secondment and then it's a fixed term contract. So I see a problem, I try and fix it. I see patterns, I try and analyse them and then give strategic advice. So I for the reasons said before, haven't been guided by a vision and don't think I will create one. You should definitely hold me to the objectives. I mean, one of the things that the last government was pretty concerned with was potentially casual and not rigorous approach to objective setting and objective. So you've got my objectives, you can make your mind up.
But if for the public, and public is listening, if you would tell what are the 3 achievements, 3 outcomes by the end of the year you wish to achieve, what would they be?
Over the whole period, I think the first one was to materially improve collaboration and trust between the civil service and the Council of Ministers, which I thought was in a state of disrepair when I arrived. To improve collaboration within the ELT itself, which I thought was at lower levels than I'd expect in an executive team. The next big one was to get a prioritised, funded and deliverable CSP out of the second of the governments, which came in unusual circumstances. Certainly to try and get 80 or 90% delivery on the 10 things that we really needed to focus on towards the end of my first secondment. The third thing is what we've been doing here is I feel we need to elevate the strategic debate on strategy, on the public finances, on strategic risk management, and try and set up the next government to have as good a debate and strategy cycle as it can in its first year so that it can set hopefully a multi-year budget. And then the last one I'm hoping to do is not only leave a very strong succession plan, but the development work we're doing with the leadership team and the civil service is leave them in a better position to be able to prioritise and deliver on the incoming government's agenda as well as their BAU services for the next 4 years. We were really pleased to see that trust in all aspects of government actually went up for the first time in years in the last lifestyle survey. Small but imperceptible change in public perception. And I think that comes from establishing a track record of clarity and delivery. And I hope we can keep going with that.
Thank you. I think what we would follow up with open letter to understand how it would be measured. How would you measure this? Because there are very important outcomes, and the next Public Account Committee will have an opportunity to